Okay. If you have any questions throughout the lecture, just feel free to put something into the chat. I've got my eye on that, so I'll go ahead and answer that. So let me just get a thumbs up from a few people that you can hear me. Okay, good. All right, so today we're going to talk about Agile methodology, which is basically a way of how you go about creating a new digital product of any sort, product or feature. And then we're going to go into wireframing using the Balsamiq wireframing technology that I shared the license with you all for. And we're going to use that to do some wireframing. Oh, hold on, some people are joining from the weight room. Okay, so we'll use the Balsamiq wireframing technology in the second half of this session to work on your products that you have already done the storyboards for, and get started really on that first step of actually completing a prototype. So, and this is all going to lead towards next week where we're going to have a full mock-up, wireframe mock-up for that prototype. And then a few of those will then go on to be made functional through coding, which we'll learn in the second half of the class. Okay, so first off, talk a little bit about what Agile methodology is. So what is Agile? First of all, has anyone heard of Agile? Okay, so very well known within coding areas. It's also very similar to a lot of principles such as lean methodology that's used in all sorts of manufacturing and operations process. But Agile really is sort of tailor-made for the coding industry. And it was developed by coders, for coders, that sort of thing. So it's a project management methodology. So it's a way of looking at how do we go from an idea of some feature or product that we want to build all the way to rolling that out to customers. And the whole premise behind it is that before Agile came along, everything was done in a huge chunk. And so you would plan out an entire product rollout that might take a year, even several years to roll out. And then you just hope that once you're done, you've got something that customers are going to want. With Agile, a lot of the founders of this methodology turned that on its head and said, well, wait a minute, that's putting too much risk on the product development. And oftentimes we don't end up producing something that customers want. So let's break this out and actually test it with customers before really investing too much into the process. So they call those little chunks iterations, and we'll go through a little bit what that means. So another key aspect of this is that all functional groups will participate in each iteration. So rather than having maybe doing all of your quality work in one silo, all of your content work in one silo, and then all of your, say, design work in another, you actually have a smaller group of people all working together as one team to bring this all the way to fruition. So we'll talk about that as well, but basically it's the whole concept of multifunctional small teams working on this. And by the way, you all in the second half of this class will be those multifunctional small teams. So we're going to mirror a lot of the principles in Agile as you start to embark on this prototype project. Another key part of it is embracing unpredictability. So you, as you could imagine, if you've got this huge product development effort, all of it's internal until you roll it out, that can be very well planned, managed from a centralized standpoint. And that's why a lot of companies used to be very comfortable with that. Here, you really have to embrace the fact that if you roll out these little chunks to customers, some of them might have unexpected responses, and that might cause you to completely change up what you thought you were going to end up working on. Now, that is a good thing because what it's doing is it's telling you, hey, rather than spending a lot of time on that thing that customers don't want or not spending enough time on something they do want, you're just taking it out to them and letting them dictate how you progress with your future development. And then finally, and we already hit upon this, but it's basically satisfying the customers. So it's keeping them involved early and often so that you can get a product ultimately that they want. Okay, so a couple graphics on this. So and this is really comparing Agile versus the older methods. One is iterative over big upfront. So rather than trying to do everything in one chunk, let's say you might have a project for your product 2.0. Rather than doing that all as one big development effort, instead what you do is you break it into, okay, well, why don't we make the patient-facing interface registration better? And then that's one iteration. And then why don't we make the patient's evaluation of their symptoms better? And then that's another iteration. So rather than doing, hey, let's make everything better, roll it out as a 2.0 product, you're doing these steps one by one, seeing how the customer reacts, and then adjusting your path after that. Second, it's experimentation over elaborative planning. So I think a lot of times people tend to get caught up in the fact that they want to get everything right? Let's try to do all the research we can to formulate our own opinions of what's going to be best for the customer and then roll it out. Here, what we're saying with Agile is, no, don't try to figure it out on your own. Just roll out a lot of different things that might not work to the customer so that you can figure out what they're going to react in a positive manner to. Let the customer tell you what's going to work. And that's sort of is in line with what we had as the assignment with the user testing, right? Let's take the product to the user, figure out how they react, where they struggle, where they have those moments of joy as a customer. Oh, okay. Monica, I've noticed that you've kind of jumped in and out a lot. Are you having trouble with the Zoom? Oh, she's still in the wait room. Monica, I noticed you've been jumping in and out a lot. Are you having problems with the Zoom? Sorry, everyone. I just want to make sure that we don't miss anyone. All right. I think Monica, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. I was having some kind of like internet issue.
Okay, so let me know if there's anything on my end that I need to improve. But it sounds like you're on now, so that's good.
Yeah, it just kept logging me in and out for some reason.
Gotcha. Okay, hopefully that does not continue. Okay,
Yeah.
so again, it's experimentation over planning. So let the customer tell you what they want rather than you trying to figure out what you think they want. And then that sort of goes hand in hand with the customer feedback over intuition. So don't follow your gut. Instead, let the customers tell you what your gut instinct should be. And then finally, it's collaborative work. So I mentioned it's a multifunctional team. So you don't just have one person driving everything within each iteration, but you have everybody working together to bring that iteration towards a release. And we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like as well. Okay, so one big, I think, paradigm shift that has made it difficult sometimes for the larger companies to adopt Agile, even though the adoption really has, I think, come to a point of saturation over the last 5-10 years, is normally they treat features as a fixed point, and then the only thing that's variable then is, do you want it faster? Do you want it cheaper? Do you want it at a lower quality? Or vice versa. Do you want it slower at a higher quality, or maybe a higher quality at a higher cost? So that's something that companies were just used to dealing with, and it made it a lot easier for them to run their product development. With Agile, it's actually the reverse. So time, quality, and cost are the same. You devote a certain amount of money and a certain amount of time to each iteration, and then it's the features that change. So you might find that a feature is more difficult to implement than expected, or you might find that the customer is telling you that the features are a little bit different. And so that will change the features, but it won't change the amount of time that you spend on a given iteration. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit later, but basically, you're letting the customer and the process dictate how many features you end up implementing in Agile methodology, as opposed to trying to keep that set from the start. Okay, so here's another graphic that compares the traditional methods of product
Oh, well, I had a
development.
question. I'm sorry.
Yes,
On the previous slide?
yes.
Yeah, I was just wondering, does that mean that at this point with the agile approach, say you come in with one big idea, one big feature that technically, if the customer is saying enough of the right stuff,
Hmm.
you basically won't even end up with that thing you first imagined because you're
Yeah,
trying to keep time, quality, and cost the same, but then features are just the variable at that point.
yeah, and basically what you will end up with is the customer will tell you what they want, but it won't be a feature, right? It'll be more a function, right? So they might say, hey, I want a better way to communicate with my doctor on your app, right? So then rather than having, okay, well, we know that they want a video chat on this app. You're keeping it more at, okay, this is what the customer's telling me. This is my mission as through this iteration. And then through the process of that, you'll figure out what you can get done in that set time and then roll that out to the customer. So it might be a video, it might just be a text message. That's to be figured out through the course of the iteration. Does that make sense?
No, yeah, it does. Are there any, is it common, I guess, to get into situations where a company wants to do an agile approach and they start with this idea that they really want to implement, but by the end of it, when they finally get it down, it's not even the same idea at that point. It's like something completely different.
Absolutely. I think that's very common. And if done properly, that's actually a very good thing, right?
Okay.
Because if you end up changing it significantly from maybe what the executives had in mind before the iteration started, that means that most likely the customer pushed you in that direction. So rather than spending a lot of time rolling out something that it turns out they didn't want, you end up rolling out something that is much more of a fit to what the customer's needs are. So the overarching principle behind this is paying attention to what the customer wants or needs.
Okay, cool.
Okay.
Thank you.
So that's a great question, by the way, because I think sometimes, and I'll try to do this as I explain, when you talk about this from a theoretical standpoint, it's hard to visualize how it works. But hopefully through your question and then my answer, that helps describe a little bit of how the Agile method might differ, right? So if we talk again about that, let's have video chat between patients and doctors, and we set all the features of, okay, well, we want the video to be able to also have the ability to comment like with Zoom, or we want them to be able to have custom backgrounds or something. And then you do that through your own intuition internally as an organization, instead of listening to the customers throughout the process, then you might end up rolling out a bunch of features that cost a lot of money that the patient didn't end up want. And then maybe you end up finding that when the patients end up communicating with those doctors, they always have their video off anyway. So it turns out that all you wanted was a text message system.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Cool. So it's all about just keeping it simple, keeping it iterative so that you can keep listening to the patients as you progress through all these iterations, or not the patients, sorry, the customers. Okay, so great question there. All right, next. So this is how we visualize a lot of what it used to look like in terms of product development to what it looks like now. So the waterfall, this is sort of the way that everyone describes the old method of product development, is let's plan and then plan over a long period of time at a large amount of cost before we get to the goal and then deliver to the customer, right? As you go down this time and cost continuum, your risk becomes a lot greater, right? And I think this is there's a parallels between what we had spoke about in previous lectures, right? Remember we were talking about risk adjustment during clinical trials and wanting to sort of cut off a trial early if you know a drug's not going to work, so that you don't end up wasting too much money on it. It's the same principle with product development in the digital world, right? We don't want to pump $1 million and a whole year into a product and then not know until the end whether or not it's successful. The other thing about Waterfall is all the difficult decisions are made at the beginning, right? So you decide at the beginning, again, going back one slide, what the features are and what you think is important for the customer. And then you execute over that long period of time and high cost of money. And then, man, you really hope that those decisions at the beginning were the right ones. Now with Agile, it's much more incremental. So each iteration is its own decision point and it's its own delivery to the customer. So with each iteration, you can roll something out to the customer, which pleases the customer because they like to see new features. They can let you know whether they're positive or not well received. And then that can help you adjust the next decision point. So the risk is much lower because yes, each iteration has its own risk of time and cost that you have to invest before you deliver. But you can see that you add all this up, it's much, much less than when you add everything up on the left with waterfall driven development. And then another upshot is that what they found empirically as they studied how Agile development works within organizations is that the goal is usually met earlier than originally planned. Okay, any questions on that? The difference between Agile versus traditional software development? All right, and of course, if you have any questions, you could either speak up or send that into the chat, and then I'll look for that. Okay, another principle of the difference between the traditional waterfall method of software development and the current Agile approach is what the teams look like. So in the traditional approach, you tend to have on the left much more siloed organizations, right? So you have experts in business analysis versus the underlying architecture versus design that are all handing their own work over to the product manager, right? So they might do their work in a silo without talking to each other. And there's not a lot of coordination. So some of them even oftentimes might have misgivings about what a different department's doing, but because they're not in the same room together all the time, because they're not interacting as a coherent team, there's not a lot of opportunity for them to express those misgivings. And then that, of course, leads to more risk. So another aspect of that is that 50% of knowledge, so half of all knowledge, ends up getting lost in the handoff from one functional group to another, right? So, you know, it might go through, let's look at it in the context of R&D, right? You have your basic R&D people that might hand it off to your preclinical people that might hand it off to your clinical people, hand it off to marketing and sales, et cetera. A lot of information gets lost within each of those handoffs. Agile, the way of thinking that is, okay, well, why don't we have, because these are such simple iterations of rollouts, they don't go over the course of a year, oftentimes it's just a week or two. Let's put them all in one room, one team working together, where it's almost like they are the team within a small startup within the company. So rather than being a part of this huge organization with lots of different departments trying to work together and not doing so very efficiently, it's just a team of maybe 5 or 6 people, each representing a different function that are all working together to roll this out to the customer. So there's not that knowledge lost because they're working together all the time. If any of them have any misgivings or concerns or even good ideas, they can express it during their iteration. The other emphasis here is T-shaped people. So does anyone know what a T-shaped person is? Probably not. Yeah. So it's really, I've only seen this mentioned within Agile, but a T-shaped person is someone, let's say this line is the depth of knowledge. So let's say that they're really good at designing. This would be their design competency, but they also might be a little bit good at the back-end coding. So this might be their skills here, and they also might be decent at user testing. So it's people who are a little bit good at everything. And by the way, they become T-shaped people just by working in these iterations, right? Because if you go back to the waterfall approach, if they're just working in their own, say, business analysis department, they do their function, you know, some big project comes to them, they say, okay, do your business analysis, figure out the market, all that. They do that work, hand it off, they never see it again. They never get exposure to what's going on in architecture, interaction design, graphic design, development. When they're working in these small teams with these other individuals, they start to pick up some of the qualities of these other departments. And that can be very valuable for their career development as well as for their use within the company as new features and new products are developed. Finally, the other concept here, and this is really, this badge is a good fit right here, right? So you see these risk cycles. With each iteration, you have your own risk cycle. And here you can see there's that cycle of, let's measure what the customers end up reacting to the previous iteration, learn from those measurements. So measurements like how much time are they spending on the software, how many mistakes are they making, how positive is their user experience. And then after learning from that, you build the next iteration based on that, right? So going back to that video chat with doctors, you find out they always turn their video off anyway. Well, then you can learn from that, maybe tone down the video capabilities and then ramp up the chatting capabilities. Okay, any questions there?
Question. So
Yeah.
for Agile, like what would the steps like consist of? Like, is there a specific number of steps or how would that work?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question for the next slide. So there's a lot on this slide, but it talks a little bit about what are those steps of a given iteration. So first off, there's a product backlog, and we'll actually talk about that in the next slide. But this is essentially a list of all the features that need to be done based on customer input. So the product owner will own this, and they will then rank it based on priorities and then create iterations based on whatever the highest ranked priorities are. So through this, they create what they call a Scrum Team. And the Scrum Team is that cross-functional team that I mentioned. They should be co-located in the same place. Obviously not during pandemic, right? But they need to do like regular Zoom meetings in this case, right? And that's what you all will be doing in the second half. So they will be meeting all the time so that they can sort of be in touch with each other's concerns and contributions. And then they make decisions on business and user value and tech solutions. So they're all making decisions together that cover the business end as well as the user experience end and the technical end. And they also have the competencies needed to build and ship it. And those are competencies that I hope you all will gain, at least at a fundamental basic level through this class. Here's an example of what a team might look like. So you might have the product owner who's essentially leading the product management aspects of this, right? So making sure that everything's being done, coordinating meetings, things like that. There might be a coach, right? So that might be me in the context of this, where if anyone has any questions of how they can best use the methodology to create features, that person then can then help them out and facilitate them through some of the activities. There's the UX person. So that person might be the one who's trying to make sure that they create the best user experience. Then there's the tester who might test that with customers to make sure that the customers are properly reacting, right? Are there any areas in which they're struggling, any areas that they really like? And then that can help inform what we're doing on the user experience side, and then as well as on the development side. So this is what a team typically looks like. There's no hard and fast rule, this is what it must look like, except that it should be cross-functional where each person has their role. But remember, they're T-shaped, so their role also extends to all of the other roles. So no one's sort of able to say, oh, well, you know, user experience, that's not my thing. I don't want to hear about it. I don't care. Instead, everyone's got an interest in how the iteration turns out in the end. And because the iterations are typically short, it's easy to do, right? If you've got like a multi-year project, some people might not even be in their job that long. And so it's harder to keep someone vested in the rollout of the end of that project. Here, because these are sprints, they call them, where they only typically are about 1 to 2 weeks, everyone's got a vested interest in making sure that it rolls out properly and really to the satisfaction of the customer. By the way, so here's a sprint. It's about 2 weeks. They have daily stand-ups, so they're meeting every day, and they're trying to do things to find value within that backlog that the product owner gave them, and then figure out sort of how they can plan out rolling out the features that can answer whatever that value is that the customer wants. Now, this actually works out pretty well. So you can see that an average sprint in this case is about 2 weeks. So that's 10 days, right? And they're meeting every day. Obviously, the expectation with you all will not be to meet every day. That might be asking too much. But if we agree to meet maybe as a team, right? So your teams are meeting twice a week, then with the 5 weeks remaining in the class, you can sort of achieve about the granularity of meetups as a sprint does. Okay. So Scrum Board, this is how the product manager ends up coordinating how the iteration runs. So they have the list of priorities of what the customer wants, and then they break that down into all the different features that they need to do. And we're going to practice with this in the next few slides. And then as they start to accomplish some of these to-dos, they put these into, okay, well, what's in progress, what's been done, and then what has yet to be done. So we'll track that throughout the rest of the course as we start working on those. Okay, so this is just sort of a graph of how what we discover from the customer can lead to delivering features that make them happy. And so there's this sort of infinite working agreement between the customers and the members of this team that keeps the customer happy and keeps the members of the team sort of at the forefront of what the customer actually wants. Okay. All right, so this is an example of what a user story might look like. So again, the user stories are how we develop our priorities within the product backlog. So they typically word it as a type of user. So whoever my target customer is, I want to do what? So what is it that they want to be able to do, right? So in the case of that video chatting with doctors, as a patient, I want to have chats with my doctors. And then of course, why do they want to do that? So I want to have chat with my doctors so that I can make sure that I have proper guidance to treat my condition, right? So maybe these are patients who their disease management is very difficult. So as a patient, I want to have constant communication with my care team so that I can better manage my disease. That might be an example. Here I made another example. As a diabetes physician, I want to be able to see my patients' Fitbit steps so that I can coach them in real time. So that's an example actually of a product that we went over in a previous lecture where you're able to take data from the patient through some of the wearables that people use now in order to create analysis and data on their condition, how it's progressing with their physicians. So any questions about how a user story works and why it's relevant for Agile methodology? All right, so just to emphasize, the user stories are how we really set the goals of what we want to accomplish in each iteration. So the user stories are told in a way that exemplifies what your customer, whoever they might be, actually wants to be able to do. So we're not saying, hey, we want to build video chat. Instead, we're saying the patient wants to be able to talk with their doctor on a regular basis to better manage their disease. And then from there, you decide what can accomplish that goal, what can help that user fulfill that story. Okay, so then those user stories go into what we talked about in the previous slide about the product backlog. You can also call it a sprint backlog because it's really what determines the cadence of or the requirements of a given iteration or sprint. There's a lot of terms here, right? A sprint and an iteration are essentially the same thing. A product backlog can sort of be the overall list of user stories that a product owner has created over time. And then the sprint backlog might be a subset of that that they want to accomplish during a given sprint or iteration. Okay, so I'll walk you through another example in detail, and this will actually be my company, WeHealth. So I created a storyboard for WeHealth, And I'd like you to start thinking about, okay, what about that storyboard that you all did with your assignment and the idea that you have for digital health? How can you start to create user stories within that? So in the case of WeHealth, the problem that we are trying to solve is that clinical trials fail to enroll patients in time. And this is often because they are not able to find all the patients that they need through traditional sources, right? So a traditional source might be an advertisement, something very top down, like putting a lot of money for a TV advertisement, or maybe hooking up with a hospital network and getting the patients within those networks to be referred to your trial. But with a higher degree of personalization and a higher interest in working with patients with rare disease, you're finding that those traditional methods are highly, highly inefficient to finding the patients that you need to be eligible for your clinical trial. So it's just not working that well. Who uses WeHealth? Well, it's sort of a double-ended customer. We have customers on the patient side and then customers on the producer side. So the producers want to be able to enroll their clinical trials, and the patients want to be able to find clinical trials that can help them. So the data inputs are clinical trial info and the patients sharing that info. The outputs are patient referrals to that clinical trial, as well as resources, healthcare resources for those patients. So a storyboard to set the scene, a clinical trial cannot find patients using traditional methods, as I mentioned before. What happens next? The patient influencers share to their communities on the WeHealth platform. So we give them tools that enable them to do this sharing. After that, when patients come onto the platform, they're screened, and eligible patients for the clinical trials that we work with are then referred to that sponsor. The desired outcome is that enrollment of clinical trials are completed on time, and of course that leads to a quicker timeline to getting that drug out there to patients with FDA approval. So let's create some user stories for WeHealth. As a patient, I want to be able to see personalized clinical options so that I can get the best possible care. So remember, we're not talking about a feature here. All we're doing is saying, what does the patient want? So a lot of patients, particularly in underserved disease areas like rare diseases, want to be able to see what's out there for them because there's just not a lot of go-to sites that can show them where those resources are. So in any sprint analysis, you want to determine how easy is it going to be to fulfill that user story, and then how can I list out some of the features that might need to be implemented to help them do that? So here I'm saying the difficulty is 1, because all it is really aggregating information that can help that patient find the resources that are right for them. So some of the functions might be categorize patient resources. So we might be able to find the resources that maybe patients who are more connected to the industry or the healthcare world can recommend, and then put those all in one place for other patients who are a little bit less connected to be able to find. Next, an eligibility screener. So something where the patient can just denote what it is that, what kind of disease they have, what are the features that, that are most concerning to them, and then what are the features of some of the resources that they believe could be helpful to them. And so an eligibility screener might help them with that. So another user story might be, as a clinical trial sponsor, I want to receive referrals from eligible patients so that I can enroll them in my trial. We say here that the difficulty might be a 2. So you typically rate the difficulty between 1 and 3, 1 being the easiest, 3 being the hardest. Here it's 2 because it's a little bit harder than aggregating data, right? We have to figure out, okay, what are some of the features of that patient and how do we match them to the clinical trial? But all the information's there. All we need is the clinical trial information, and we put that onto WeHealth, and then match the patients based on the features of their disease with that trial, and then refer those patients to the clinical trial sponsor. So there's a few things that we need to do here in order to fulfill that user story, and then through that sprint or iteration, we'll figure out exactly what those features look like. Okay, last user story. As a patient influencer, I want tools that can help me share and see my impact so that I can be a better advocate for my community. And by the way, these user stories are typically created by the user. Now, in the case of this particular class, you might not be able to come up with that. You might have to do some assuming here. Now, if you can get user story from actual target users, that's awesome. That's extra credit. But that's really the way that it's supposed to happen, right? From your interaction with the users, you get a story of what they want, and then you build sprints, iterations out of that to roll out features that please the customer. Okay, so here it's a little bit harder because you have to figure out, how can I motivate this influencer? What are all the different ways that I could help them see their impact? What are the different ways that I can help them share? So I put this as the highest difficulty of 3. So some examples are having campaigns for specific causes. So creating campaigns that match the desires of that influencer and match the community within which that influencer lives and has influence. Also tools that help them share. And then points, or some sort of system that helps them see their impact. So this is an example of 3 user stories that I use for WeHealth in order to roll out new features for our product. Any question about the user stories or how that fits into a sprint or iteration or just in general agile methodology? Yes.
I have a question about the difficulty. So when choosing the difficulty, is it based off like your team's capabilities or like the difficulty of the task?
Yes, so it's based off of your team's capabilities as well as the difficulty, right? They sort of go hand in hand. Basically, it's an assessment that you do before the sprint happens so that you can set some numbers, right? I think that the whole point of doing the difficulty is really a management technique so that you can calculate, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but a velocity, right? So a velocity is basically how many of these stories are you able to solve within a certain amount of time. And then the velocity is basically amount of difficulty points over time, right? Because not every story is created equal. Some of them are easier and maybe could be done in 2 days. Some are more difficult and might take the entire 2 weeks. So it's all relative. There's no absolute objective answer of what a difficulty rating should be. The only absolute objective answer that I have for you on difficulty is that it needs to be a number created by that team based on what they feel that their capabilities are and how hard the problem is to solve. So they all have buy-in, and then that enables them to, as they start to rate their velocity or their efficiency as they go through the sprint backlog, they know, well, we said this was going to be hard, and turns out that it's taking a little bit longer, but that's okay because we assigned it a high difficulty. Does that answer your question? Okay, great. Okay, so I've got an activity for you all. So I had you all as an assignment, create your storyboards. Now I want you to take a look at those and create at least one user story for that storyboard, and then we'll go ahead and share that. So I'll give you, let's go with 10 minutes to create that user story, because I want you to not only create the user story, but also create some of the functions and rate the difficulty for that story. Okay, so I'll keep it on this slide so that you can see an example. And I'd like you to come up with this for your particular idea, and then we'll share some of those stories after the 10 minutes. Okay, so we'll come back at 3:20 with your stories, and then we'll talk about it.
Will there be a Google Doc to fill it out, or we're just going to use this slide to write it down?
Yeah, you know, I didn't create a form for that because I think at this point, this is something that is sort of part of your project. So I would just create a Word document or whatever you want to capture this information, and then keep it with you, because you'll use this as you start to create features for your prototype. Okay, would anyone like to share their user story?
I'd like to share mine.
Yes.
So mine, based off I use the idea generator for the homework for the storyboard. So mine was eBay for wellness. And so my user story, so basically kind of background for the eBay for wellness, my thing was just like, there's people who want specific goals. So for example, in the homework, I had included someone who wants to gain weight. And so for eBay for wellness, they would have like a form that you fill out on their website, and you would input data such as like weight, height, and your goal of gaining weight, and it would introduce you to like a range of products that are on eBay that would help you reach that goal. So it would be like protein shakes and like maybe books to help guide you. And so for this user story, mine was, as a vegan, I am looking for a platform that provides me with healthy vegan choices so that I can get the best possible products for low cost.
I like that. That's great. And so then you mentioned some of the features that you would then build on top of that, right? Or the functions, sorry. So what would some of those functions be? Let's summarize that again.
For my homework or for this?
No, just for the user's story, right? So you have the vegan who wants to find healthy products for them so that they can, live more well. What might some of the functions be that they would need? I think you mentioned one, right, at the beginning.
Did I? I forgot.
Or just like the list, right?
Yeah, like basically like it would create a list of not only products but like also guides. So maybe there's like a book that helps you helps guide like what to look for in like products.
Very cool. Yeah. So I see two things there, right? One is a list of products that might be relevant for the vegan who's looking for something. And then the other thing would be that guide, which maybe it's like a step-by-step guide, maybe it's a book, or maybe it's like a questionnaire. And based on their answer to the questionnaire, they get something. So there's a lot of different directions you could go from that. And then, of course, as we mentioned with agile development, you want to make sure you get the customer's feedback as much as possible so that you can figure out which among those things would be most desirable for that customer. Cool. Thanks, Alvin, for sharing. Anyone else?
So for mine, I created something called, where did I put that? So I created something called the Core Animo. So basically what I got from the whole thing was VR for mental health, which I subsequently adapted for a VR platform that was supposed to be applied to basically applied behavioral analysis or treatment for people who are on the autism spectrum. So what that eventually turned into, as far as this is concerned, was basically something that would allow that kind of analysis, whether it's sensory desensitization or basically anything that's applicable in that realm. It would basically allow it to be a little bit more flexible and a little more portable as well. So basically you could upload it to various VR headsets and stuff like that.
Sure.
So for the user, I basically put, as a provider, I want tools that help me customize and tailor treatment plans so I can further assist my patients in leading full and productive social lives. And then as far as functions are concerned, I did rate that at a pretty high difficulty. I haven't fully thought out how the coding or anything would work for that, but you would need a diagnosis-based metadata. I don't know if that's the right term, but basically based on what kind of diagnosis you get and what kind of patient notes there are, that would essentially algorithmically sync your needs with a set of simulations. So you would obviously need a simulation bank as well, or an archive, and then the ability to alter that based on how your treatment is progressing and essentially your updated prognosis. So that's what I got. Again, a little more on the complicated side, but that's how it's going.
Yeah, very cool. I really like that. And it's a good example of something that, like you said, might be a little bit on the harder side to implement, right? There's no expectation that anyone in this class is going to be able to do any VR programming. However, if you were to take that on the prototype stage, I could envision something where maybe instead of creating the actual VR, what you do is you create maybe that survey that then connects a patient or a provider who's got a patient with the right videos, right? So maybe it's like a YouTube sort of interface where the YouTube videos are instead VR programs. And then by taking that initial survey, they get matched with the right program. So just thinking out loud, but that's an example where you can take something that sounds very intimidating, right? And making it easier to implement a prototype for, because then with that prototype, you can take that to actual providers, actual patients, and get more of a market assessment, a customer feedback on your particular idea before you end up spending the millions of dollars that it might take to build a robust virtual reality platform. So again, that's sort of part of the Agile methodology of, well, let's just build something super simple that gets the point across of what I'm trying to do, get customer feedback before dumping the big bucks into actually creating virtual reality capabilities.
Yeah, for sure.
Thanks a lot, Zaid.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
I'd actually like to talk about mine because this is something that I'm kind of passionate about because it's something I wish I had. So my, I guess, user story was that as a healthcare provider, I want tools to help me understand medical documentation better so that I can provide more accurate and customized care to my patients.
Okay.
And that's coming from my history of being a medical scribe for the past 3 years. And there's a lot of times when I'm working with doctors and nurses that we get medical documentation from another facility and they start using acronyms or shorthand that isn't common medical knowledge. It's kind of personalized to wherever their facility is or whatever region they may be within the US. So sometimes it's a little bit difficult to figure out what the previous providers were trying to say about a patient, which can affect care. So this means like oftentimes we have to call that facility or call that doctor to get them to say things verbally. Other times too, doctors, I know you've probably heard the saying or like doctors have really good chicken scratch. So a lot of times when reading doctors who write things with pen, you can only make out 4 of the 9 words. So you have to go on Google and you have to kind of type a really bad word and then it will give you a bunch of suggestions, but none of them may be medically related. So what I wanted to do was to make some sort of search engine that could do these things. So for the list of functions, I was thinking of basic stuff just such as search medical terminology and medications and dosages, but then to make it more customized to providing that better medical care, also include the ability to search acronyms and shorthand, as well as to even spell words partially bad, but then be able to apply a filter and say that I have no idea what this word is, but these letters are involved in a diabetic patient or they were in a trauma. So maybe it will help the search engine figure out what the previous provider was trying to say. So that was kind of what I was hoping to do with this project.
Yeah, very cool. And, you know, I think that definitely sounds like something that, especially if you've got the passion around it, you could take the prototype that you end up building through this class to the next stage, right? And maybe build a business plan around that and then have that potentially be something that you could get some investment in. Now, I would say, whenever it's something that we're very passionate about, and the same goes for me, sometimes we can be a bit too dedicated to certain ideas that we came up with on our own. So this is where I think adhering to the Agile methodology and taking all the different ideas that we want, but making sure that they adhere to that user story, and then running the different iterations by the user so that we can get an understanding of, okay, you know, well, maybe they want, you know, a search engine for this or that, but they don't want it to take too much time, or they want it to be automated, right? So you can figure out more how the user wants to take your ideas to improve their lives, but then sort of spin it around in a way that actually makes sense within their day-to-day, right? So I think this is where Agile development can be particularly beneficial, if where we have something that we really care about, we've got all these different ideas for it, but we got to figure out, well, what are the simple ones, the easiest ones that will have the largest impact on that user story. So thanks so much for sharing that, Derek, and I look forward to seeing it. Okay, anyone else?
I would like to share mine just to check what you think. If like, is it realistic? So now that I'm thinking this through, this might be a bit too big to swallow. So I used that program you created that matches the different words together. I came up with EHR.ai. So pretty much, it's a electronic health record that's equipped with artificial intelligence. The problem it's supposed to solve is pretty much that physicians are spending too much time on these EHRs, and they like to spend more time with the patients. So the data inputs would be like the patient information, their symptoms, diagnoses, and the outputs would probably be automated data entry, treatment options, and pretty much it would be a more efficient way to administer treatment, so it saves the doctor a bit of time. So the blurb I came up with is that as a primary care physician, I want to spend less time entering data into the patient's record and spend more time with the patient, so I can give more the best possible care. So the list of functions would be automation tools for data entry and algorithms for recommending patient-specific treatment options.
Yeah, very cool. And I would say, I think that it's definitely ambitious to try to roll that out within a hospital tomorrow, right? But what you can do is break it down into much smaller sections to see maybe how would that automation work within a very small subset of what a doctor does, right? So maybe you just stick with blood work as an example, and there's a lot of data entry with the results that come back from the test there. And so you show, well, what happens if we maybe take our knowledge of what the range of the test should be to help autofill what they're inputting, or something like that, or maybe automatically do calculations for them. So that way you can pick a very small part that maybe you think is the biggest user story pain, and then run that by those users and see, okay, well, would this be helpful to them? And if so, you know, you got something that's worth continuing to build upon. And then, you know, the other difficult part is just the business aspect of it, of how do you get within a health network, because they're notoriously difficult to do. But there are a lot of different, I guess, hacks that health networks such as Cedars-Sinai have come up with that enable people who want to do very isolated improvements within the healthcare job flow to do that within their network. And it just ends up being plugged onto whatever their major system is, like Epic, that they use for electronic health records. So it's definitely doable, I think, both from a implementation, you know, technology standpoint, as well as a business standpoint. There's always ways to end up getting this in, because there's just a lot of money right now into figuring out how we can make digital health work. Okay, so thanks for sharing that. Anyone else?
I can talk about mine.
Yes.
So my idea was like an AI in like medical imaging. So like for people who are going and having like brain surgery and stuff, one of the biggest things is like you get a lot of different scans from a lot of like MRIs, CTs, like EEGs, all these different things. And you have one or more radiologists reading like all the different scans. So like my thought was an AI program that can kind of take the data from all of those and combine them into one, so that you can have a more like lined up view of like the person's brain and get a better like understanding of the boundaries that you will be like dealing with within brain surgery. So some of like the functions that I thought about for like the like presentation of it was like being able to like combine all that data and actually present it where it's something that a radiologist can still look at and make sure like it looks okay and make like a definite like decision on things like that. And also like being able to like determine, like assess like inconsistencies or the mutation or whatever it is within those scans, and like point out like the boundaries that the AI has determined like on the software, so that it can just be like double checked and stuff by radiologists, as well as like being able to like hold the original scans like on the website somewhere so that they can pull those up for reference and stuff for future things.
Yeah, very cool. And that's, I think you've hit upon what's really a hot spot within AI technology of how it relates to medical imaging. So I think you're really right on point of where customer need meets some of the capabilities of what AI can do. And I think one thing, if you end up wanting to pursue this throughout the rest of the course, for you to consider is look at what some of those other benchmark platforms are that are using AI for imaging, and see where what you have might differ or offer an advantage that they don't offer, and then focus in on that. Because, you know, AI for anything can be very difficult to implement on like the broad spectrum. And that's why, you know, like for instance, what I was recommending to Mohammed was try to figure out a narrow focus within that of where you would apply that AI to help some of them out. Maybe that's you feel is being ignored by current technologies. So I think that if you do that, that could really have a lot of promise as we move forward. Cool. Thanks so much for sharing. Zaid, are you raising your hand or?
Yeah, I am. Actually,
okay.
This is actually isn't a question, but Kelsey, I wanted to tell you that if you're really looking for AI and imaging and so forth, I don't know if they're using AI for this necessarily, but there's a technology that I think is out of Switzerland right now, but it's actually a combination of MRI, CT, PET scan, I think, and a couple of different radiograph types. It's called a Virtopsy, so a VIRTOPSY. So that might be a pretty good starting point for you to look at. Again, I don't think AI is involved in it, but if you're looking for kind of a good jumping off point or a good platform to start with, that might be something to look at.
Cool, thanks so much. Yeah, by the way, I love that. I would love, you know, anytime you all want to comment on what someone else says in a constructive, positive way, I welcome that. So thanks so much for sharing that benchmark opportunity, Zaid. One other thing that I'd add with regard to AI is it's very much a buzzword right now. So I want, if you're thinking about AI, think about very specifically, how is it going to help, right? How is it going to solve a need that is painful to the user in a very specific way? So that's just, you know, a general piece of advice I'd give with using any sort of buzzword that also applies to like blockchain or machine learning or something like that, is just get real specific and think about what is the pain that I'm solving for the customer in a very specific way. And then we can start to work through, okay, well, this is how AI can help solve that pain. Cool. All right. Anyone else? Yes. Kevin.
I kind of had an idea of using like the Internet of Things for sports medicine and rehab, like a Fitbit device, but kind of like used for like rehabilitation, like sports injuries and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really. Go ahead.
So as a user, just be able to, I guess, wear internet connected device to be able to like just and I required.
Yeah, and I think one thing about Internet of Things is, it's probably beyond our capability, at least in this class, to actually build the Fitbit or whatever we're going to be using. But as I said earlier, it's very feasible to just create dummy data, what you think that might look like through a Fitbit, and then just figure out the user experience end of, okay, well, do I want to do certain graphs or analysis to help that athlete through their physical training? So what was the story for that?
Just so like as an athlete, I would want to be able to use the data acquired from the device, so I could just heal for my injuries and be able to come up with a better rehab plan.
Yeah, very cool. And would you envision this, and you don't have to have an answer right now, but would you envision this being used mainly at home by that athlete, or would it be something that they might get involved with their physical therapist on a clinical level? Is it more sort of like a user tool or a clinical tool?
So I was thinking like a user tool, just in case, let's say they're a pro athlete and they were away from their, I guess, team position. So maybe be able to do it like a telemedicine kind of way and be able to use it from a far away location.
Cool. Yeah, I like it. All right. Anyone else?
I wanted to share mine.
Yes.
So my company I created, it sounds like yours a lot. I didn't realize that, but it's My Health. And it's basically like a Facebook or almost like a MySpace for your weight loss journey. Mm-hmm. And the storyboard is, as a patient, I want to have access to tools that will help me share my journey with my friends and providers so that I can be accountable on my weight loss journey. And the points were recipes and workouts on My Health, connect with friends and providers, and sharing tools. So basically, it would be like you create a profile and you share like, your current weight, your current inches or centimeters on your body, your current eating habits, and you can connect with friends and providers so they can track you as you're working out. You can track your workouts. You can even record your workouts and share it with friends, new recipes that you're using, things like that.
Very cool. Yeah, there's actually a lot of recent evidence out there that coaching from your peers, particularly your friends or family, can really help change behavior. I think I've seen that most specifically in the context of diabetes, which has some parallels with weight loss as well. So I think you're definitely barking up a good tree there. And then just figuring out, okay, well, what will that coaching look like? What would the user experience be? I think would be some of the challenge, and hopefully something you can get by talking to some prospective users.
Right.
Okay. Anyone else? Okay, so we'll move on to the next slide. So the next part of this class is going to be a wireframe walkthrough. So I think rather than doing one 10-minute break, I'm going to do 2 5-minute breaks. So we'll do a 5-minute break before we start this wireframe walkthrough, because I want to give you all a chance to get set up. So raise your hand if you have installed Balsamiq yet. Okay, so if you haven't, I'm going to copy the link for you and then post it in the chat. And then I want you to just follow this link. And then once you're set up, it's kind of like a PowerPoint or a Google Sheets, and it's part of Google Drive. I've given you all access to the license. If you have trouble, if they say that you don't have access, just message me the email that you've associated with Google Drive, if you haven't already sent me that. And then you can get started with Balsamiq. So then what I'll do is, in the next part of the class, I'm going to walk through wireframing with WeHealth as an example. And then I want you all to follow along with your own company. So you can sort of get started on that wireframing using the same principles that I'm using as I build a wireframe for my company. Any questions on that? Okay, so I posted the link on the chat. Go ahead and just click the chat if you haven't already set it up. And then we'll be back at 3:50 to get started on the wireframe walkthrough. Okay, let's get started with the walkthrough. Raise your hand if you're okay, if you're all set up. Or actually, no, sorry. Raise your hand if you're not okay and you need some help with the setup. Get some thumbs up if everyone's good.
I installed it, but I don't know how to get to that page that you're at.
This walkthrough page. So go to your Google Drive. And in fact, I'll just show you all. Okay, so let me start from the Google Drive itself. Okay, as an example, when you go to the Google Drive, you click New, and then it should show up as a new thing that you make. I don't think I have it on this account, but it should be under New and then More. There should be Balsamiq. So let me switch my account to KGI. Are you able to see it?
Yes, I got it.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you.
Yeah, so once you're on your account that I've shared it with you for and you've downloaded it on, you just click New. Oh, my computer's being slow. But New and then Other, and then it's or More, and then Balsamiq will show up right here. All right. And then once you do that, that should bring up the Balsamiq screen that looks a little bit like this. Okay, so I want to do a quick overview of the different parts of this screen. So the canvas is what's in the middle. It's just like PowerPoint or anything else, where this is where you actually put the images for the wireframe. On the left, there's the frames. So this is the equivalent on PowerPoint of, say, the slides. So each frame might be a different slide. With a lot of wireframes, oftentimes they'll try to put everything onto one frame. But if there's things that there's no reason for them to be on the same frame, then sometimes it can be easier to break that out into multiple frames. On the top are your assets. So they're, as you can see also above the assets, they're grouped by category. So some might be buttons. It's basically common things that you would see on a website. So I used to, before Balsamiq, do wireframes on PowerPoint, which PowerPoint's nice because it's very flexible, but oftentimes you just spend a lot of time building what a button's supposed to look like. Here on Balsamiq, they've already got pre-made buttons that you can choose from. On the right is description, and this is basically how you just describe what that product is that you're making. You can also choose themes. So for instance, you see sketch and wireframe. Wireframe's just a little bit more refined looking. Sketch looks a little bit more like something you would draw with a pen. It's stylistic in order to just make sure that everyone knows, hey, this is a wireframe. Don't pay attention to the design. It's more about the order of the content and how the features look. Now, so there's the assets, which enable you to kind of browse for what all these different features might look like if you were to put them onto your platform. Once you get used to what's on here, I find it's much more efficient to just use the quick add. So you'll see me using this a lot during the walkthrough, which is basically just if I want to put a button in, I might type into this quick add BUTTON, and then all of the buttons will pop up, and then I can choose which one I like. So for me, it's just a matter of preference. I prefer to type into a search as opposed to browsing through these, but they both work. And then finally, import assets. So this is something that if you find the existing assets a bit lacking with what you want, you can import some that someone else in the community has already made to meet their needs. For the most part, anything you want, someone has probably already built, and then you can just put that in. All right. So I think that's it for the slides. Now I'm going to switch over to the Balsamiq web frame. And let me just hide my bookmarks so I have more space to show you. Okay, so can you all see my Balsamiq? All right, cool. So the first thing I did is I pasted my requirements. So I had written down my own user requirements, or user stories, sorry, that I shared with you. Now what I'm gonna do is put them into a text box just so that I can look at them. So here I typed into the search box text area shows up. So I can then click that, and now here's my text. When I double click this, it allows me to paste all the text that I got about my user stories in there. And now I've got these to look at. All right. So I just have this here in order that I can always see the functions that I want to put in and the user stories that I want for the customers that I want to serve. I can have that front of mind all the time. Okay, so I would encourage you all to also do the same with yours. All right, so all the user stories that you just wrote down, you might as well just put that into your wireframe so that you've got it and you can check them out. The other thing that I'd like you to share is, is share your wireframe with me, right? That way I can take a look at it and I can provide you with feedback as you progress. So all you have to do is share, and then share it with, I'm gonna type it onto the chat, my email, wraasch@kgi.edu. Okay, for some reason it says it's unavailable, probably because I have a million applications running right now between this and Zoom. But anyway, that's something that I want you all to do sometime between now and next week when we do the presentations. That way I can provide you all with some pre-feedback before you turn it in, okay? So the first thing that I'm gonna wanna do is figure out, and this is something that you all will have to assess individually, is your application going to be desktop or mobile? This is a very big question, right? Do I want this to be something that can fit on a big laptop screen, or is it something that I need to be able to fit in the palm of the hand? The reason why this is so important is because it really is going to determine the entire framework through which you design your application. There's a whole concept of mobile first versus, desktop first. And you want to figure out, is your application mobile first or desktop first, right? So for instance, I would say probably Kevin's might be mobile first, right? I don't want to give any answers. You can do whatever you want. But when I pictured the story, Kevin, that you were telling me, I pictured, okay, well, this might be something on the phone because the athlete wants to see their progress in real time without having to log in on their computer. I might picture, well, actually, let me throw it out to you all. Does anyone have an idea that they think wouldn't work well on the phone or maybe would be better off on a computer? I know these days everything's on the phone. No one? Okay. So we'll go mobile first then. I'll show you on mobile then for mine. So I'm gonna call this mobile because it's gonna be the mobile version of my app. Now to create a new frame, you click this plus sign on the upper left. And I'm gonna call this desktop just so that I've got a way to look at both. Now, if yours is mobile first, I'm not gonna require that you have a different desktop and different mobile version for each. Just focus on one, but I wanna show you for completeness what they look like. So here's something I would drag for the desktop. And I gotta figure out how big I want it. So these numbers that pop up as I enlarge and shrink the browser window are pixels. Now in general, a desktop is gonna be about 1,000 pixels wide. So just to help you calibrate that. And then mobile is about half that, right? So usually actually a little bit more than half, like, or less than half, sorry, like 400 pixels. So here's basically what a browser window might look like. Then I could put things like, say, headers, right? I could put like home, about us, maybe blog, or something like that, right? So that's an example of what a desktop page might look like. Now, because we're going to focus on mobile, I'll put more of my effort into here. So I'm going to quick add because I don't see it here and I don't like to browse, but you can if you like to browse. And just type mobile. Okay, here's, oh, actually, this was not what I wanted. I didn't want this mobile phone. So instead, I'm going to look for, here, smartphone. All right, so here's my canvas basically for a smartphone. I'm gonna make this a larger phone just so it's easier to work with. And now I get to start building my app. So any questions? Has everyone gotten this far with your own app? Ooh, I think I might have lost someone. Well, hopefully they're able to get back. In any case, if you end up having any internet problems, totally understandable. I'll end up posting this on YouTube, so you have all the information to follow along. I'll also post some resources that enable you to follow along with other people that have used Balsamiq to create a wireframe. Okay, so I'm going to do this for WeHealth. One cool thing about Balsamiq is that not only can you use their inputted images, but you can also upload your own. So with WeHealth, I already have a logo and I kind of want to use it. So I'm going to do that. I'm just going to open my logos. And now one cool thing that you can do here is just drag it onto the screen. It's going to import, and now I got my logo. So super simple, just had to drag the logo onto the screen, and now I've got it and I can put it onto my phone. So I want to put the heart on the upper left, just so that everyone knows, hey, this is the WeHealth logo. And now I'm going to want to put some sort of nav bar here, right? So because I'm lazy and I don't like to look for things, I'm just going to type nav bar. Okay, here's a link bar. So I want to think about what different categories do I want for my nav bar? Okay, well, definitely home, but maybe I want to make this link to home. So I don't need home here. So instead, maybe I'm going to put, okay, well, I want them to know who we are. So about us, because WeHealth runs, remember I was talking about what the influencers want. They want to know that there's a campaign specifically for them. So I'll put something like causes to represent each of those campaigns. Maybe we want to have a blog and then a contact us. All right, so here's my nav bar. Okay, so now all of a sudden I've got my logo as well as my nav bar to help different patients navigate around the website. Okay, now maybe I also want to break down the causes. So what I would do, and the best way to show this is to create a vertical drop down, right? So all right, we can do this let's do the vertical tabs. So maybe within the causes, I want to have oh, and by the way, whenever I insert these, they typically have pre-populated information. Like here it says first tab, second tab, third tab. And then when I double click, it allows me to change that. So let's say the first thing I want to do something for COVID-19 as a cause. I want to do something for diabetes as a cause. maybe something for veteran health, and then something for rare disease, right? So I did that, and now these update. And now to show that this is something that I want to associate with causes, what I'll do is I'll add an arrow that basically points from causes to that vertical thing, okay? Now I'd like this arrow to be one way, so I'm gonna click it, and then I can unclick, oh, not that one, this one, okay? So I unclicked the right arrow, and now is pointing from causes to this dropdown, okay? So this is just communicating through the wireframe, hey, when that user clicks causes, there's gonna be a dropdown that enables them to choose these different causes, okay? Does that make sense? This is kind of the basics of how a nav bar might work on your particular wireframe for the app. Okay, now maybe I want a header. So one thing I can do is I can type image in the quick add, and then it'll just give me a sort of a hold or a stopper, right? So here's basically telling me, put an image here. I don't want to deal with the design yet, so I'm not going to do it. I'm just going to leave this X here, but it tells everyone, hey, there's going to be an image right here that's going to show something around my logo, or whatever I want the users who arrive here to actually see. Okay? So after that, I want to maybe have another text input or text block of text. So maybe I don't care what this says for the purposes of the wireframe. So I can just do, if I click text, right, there's this block of text, which just kind of gives you gibberish. All right, now let's put a button. Okay, so type button, drag that down here. And now what do I want my button to say? Well, if you remember back in the user story, I wanted patients to be able to find resources for them based on their needs. So why don't we call this find health resources? All right, so I clicked the button, that popped up, then I typed what I wanted it to say. Now, anytime you put a button, you need to show within the wireframe what that button actually does. I'm going to zoom in just so you can see a little bit more clearly. And the way you do that is the same way we did with the drop-down menu. So use these arrows that kind of point out of the main screen to instruct whoever's looking at the wireframe to see, okay, well, once this happens, it's going to go to something new. In this case, it's actually going to go to a whole new screen. So I'm going to actually create another phone and put it right next to this phone. One other cool thing about Balsamiq is that it sort of, you can see these guidelines, right? So it matches and snaps to grid based on what what's already around. So if I need something to be centered or I need two things to be aligned, it automatically allows me to do that. So here they're not aligned, but let's say I want them aligned. I kind of go until I see those lines pop up right here, okay? All right, so I mentioned I've got this button and I want that to go to a new screen. So I'm going to create another arrow. I could add it through the quick add, just typing arrow, right? Or I could just take this existing arrow, copy using Command C, and then paste. So copy and paste as you would with the commands on any other program. Okay, so I'm going to show this, that once I click this, it's going to go to this screen. Now on this screen, we're going to have the screener, right? So I might put a title in. This says a big title as default. So screener. Now, I don't want another title. Now here I just want text. So how about paragraph of text. Now we say, what kind of resource are you looking for, right? So super generic, right? I'm not trying to overthink it too much. I just want to ask them a very simple question to get them to answer it. Now, maybe I want to give them choices, right? So let's see what happens if I type radio, right? So radio buttons are a good way to show multiple choice. All right, so maybe this radio button says something like clinician for my disease. Now I'm going to copy and paste to make another one. Maybe the next one says meet patients like me. All right, and let's make one more that says maybe a diagnosis. Oh, and then one more, let's not forget clinical trials, because that was the whole point of the app to begin with. All right, so now we know from here that once they click Find Health Resources, they're going to go to another screen that then enables them to answer questions that might lead to a match, okay? And let's say, so I want to show progress as an example. So I typed progress into the quick add, and turns out they've got a progress bar. So maybe I just want the user to be able to see how far they are in the survey so that they don't get bored or intimidated. Okay, another thing I can do with this, when I click the progress bar, and this goes for anything that I might insert into my wireframe. When I click that inserted object, I can then do things with the style. So let's say I don't want it to be solid, but I want it to be striped. Then I can do that, right? Or if I want it to be standard or narrow, I can do all of that. Let's say I want the value to be at like 80%. I can show that. So this is all possible. And maybe just to show a little bit about what that means, under here, I want to say something like question 1 of, or let's say 4 of 5. Okay. All right, so here's an example of what the screener might look like. And this only took, what, 5 minutes to create this screener. Would take much, much, much longer to actually create that via code. So now I've got something that I can take to patients and say, hey, do you like this? Do you like the progress bar? Do you like the way that the questions are lined up? And then they can give you feedback before you put all of the effort in of actually coding it in. Okay, so this might be a good point for me to ask if anyone has any questions before I move forward. I don't want to move too fast. Is everyone able to add kind of their own version of this right now, or are you doing that? I'm a little bit concerned that having all these programs open with the Zoom and the Balsamiq might overload your computers. So, but it sounds like everyone's okay. No one's computer is overloading. If you need to, just let me know. You could maybe turn off your video or something if your computer sounds like it's about to take off. Okay, so I mentioned this screener, but I also mentioned that I wanted their answers to the screener to lead to a clinical trial or some study that they might match with. So let's see what happens when they do that. Or let's at least illustrate it through this wireframe. Okay, so I'm going to create another phone screen. So I typed phone into quick add. I like to use I had been using the smartphone, but I could use the iPhone. Doesn't really matter. They all look the same. So let's just use the iPhone for this. Okay, so now I want to show what happens when I've matched. And actually, one thing that I probably should have written is, I could make a comment here. So I just entered comment into the quick add, and now I've got this comment. So I could say here, this is my patient screener after clicking find a resource button. So it's really nice to be able to annotate, right? Because when you're doing this, especially when you're working with a team, it might not be as clear to someone else what you're getting at with these arrows. So you can use these little comment stickies to illustrate to whoever you're working with what you are getting at. So now I want to see when a patient matches eligibility criteria for a clinical trial. All right, so quick add, I'm gonna go back to title. And so they've matched. So why don't we say something like, congrats, we found a match. You know what, the title does not want to go in 2 lines. So why don't we say congrats on the big title. And this is actually an opportunity for us to then create a subtitle. So we got congrats on the top line in big font. And then we've got we found a match in subtitle font below, okay? Now, I'm typing image because maybe I want to show some image about the clinical trial right below that. And then, how about just a block of random text, because I don't know what the heck the clinical trial actually wants to say, so we'll just make this generic as possible. And then if we're maybe using this to user test with a particular clinical trial sponsor, customer, we can then just show, hey, this is what it'll look like. And then we can implement your IRB approved information along with an image along. And so then they don't get confused by maybe some generic image you said that you have there. Instead, you're able to let their imagination run of what they would want to put there, okay? Now, we're gonna need some buttons, right? So once they've actually matched, how do we enable them to send their contact information to the sponsor? So I'm gonna type input. Now here's the text input here. And I want to put, what do I want? I want their name. Okay, now I'm highlighting both, copying and pasting so I don't have to do that over again. Maybe I want their email. Highlight both, copy and paste. And then their phone, okay? And so then I have a button maybe that says submit. Copy and paste that, create a button next to it that says cancel if they're not interested, right? And I do believe I can even change the color. So when I click the submit button, let's say I want to make that green. So now it's sort of guiding the user to clicking the button that we really want them to click, which is submit. Right? If you remember from our user experience lecture, it's nice to guide them towards the actions that you actually want them to perform. Okay, so I'm just going to center that. All right, so now we actually have a nice story. We've got our home page. We're saying, okay, well, there's also a lot of different campaigns. And then if they want to find health resources, they click the button, then they take a screener. The screener tells them the progress they've made. And then based on their criteria, we match them. And then they can submit their contact information here. So let's go back to our user stories. So we've said, as a patient, I want to be able to see personalized clinical options so that I can get the best possible care. I want categorized patient resources in an eligibility screener. So we've built here the eligibility screener, but we haven't built the resources yet. So let's do that. All right. So let's try this menu. Oh no, not this menu, sorry. Why don't we actually try a search? So we've got a search bar right here. And then let's actually say I want to put a filter in too. So I got a search bar and a filter. Now, I actually don't like the size of this filter. So I'm going to click it and then change it to be more in line with the search bar. Okay, now when I type into the search, I want to be able to bring health resources up here. So let's show an example of what that might look like. So maybe these are my search results. And let's say one of them might be, you know, Dr. Jones. Let's say this is for COVID, right? So infectious disease practice. And another might be, you know, latest infection data. Another might be essential COVID-19 info. Another might be crowdsourcing initiatives, right? Because we know that a lot of people have been crowdsourcing PPE, things like that. So let's say that I've got these different categories. Oops. Actually, you know what? We can make these a part of, well, so let's call these categories actually. Okay, so that's categories that maybe come from this filter. So here what I'm saying is, okay, well, I want to be able to search, but I also want them to be able to choose categories and then display below, you know, whatever some of those ideas might be. And let's say that I want, or some of those resources might be, and let's say that I want the resources to be a bunch of pictures, right? Say I want it to look kind of like Pinterest or something. So when I do this search or I do this filter, they come out all nice like this. All right, so now I've satisfied the categorized patient resources, the eligibility screener, clinical trial information, matching patients, referring contact info. So I've done all that. Now the only thing left is sort of this as an influencer, I want these tools. But you know what, I said that was the hardest thing anyway. So I'm probably not gonna create a wireframe for that in the span of 30 minutes like I did just now. But I think you can see what can be accomplished in a short amount of time through wireframing. Any questions? I think this would actually be a good opportunity for some people to share their screen, if technically we can make that work. So would anyone like to share what they've built? Add that it's kind of towards the end of class, so this would be a good time to get participation points in if you haven't participated yet. Anyone? There will be no judgment, right? This is something that we've created very quickly, so no worries if it's not a finished product or doesn't quite look as clean as maybe the demo that I shared with you. Because I also know what WeHealth looks like. This is an existing product. You all are at a disadvantage in that your product doesn't exist yet. So you still have to do a lot of thinking as to what that might look like. So anyone want to share? Nia?
Mine's not really that done. I was trying to go with you, but you were going really fast, so there's
Oh,
not
sorry.
a page.
Samita? Sorry, you're on mute.
I like open it, but like my Wi-Fi keeps going in and out and it's like not loading properly. Like, does that tend to happen with Balsamiq?
It hasn't been a problem with me, but you know what? It might just be because of the fact that we're doing Zoom and Balsamiq at the same time.
Okay.
So no worries. I actually have more slides anyway. I was just thinking that it'd be nice for people to share, but I understand that it's kind of going a little bit fast. I'll post this on YouTube as quickly as I can so that you've got this run through. There's also some resources that I put onto the slides. So that includes, there's a user guide, which is very thorough, right? It's got all of the different features of Balsamiq, but it might be a little bit difficult to wade through. I found this wireframe creation walkthrough video very useful. It's a 3-part series. The first video is only about 25 minutes, I think, and it's very helpful. So you only really need to watch the first one, and if you want to keep watching, you can watch the subsequent videos. But I think if you just review what I post on YouTube, that should be helpful. And I'll be very active in responding to any questions that you all have, because I know that, you know, it's a new program and there might be some hiccups along the way. Okay, so next slide's on user testing. So with user testing, well, actually, first of all, you all had some great responses with the type of user testing that you'd all like to use. Would anyone like to talk about your response? Why don't I give 5 minutes because I realize that we still have one more break left. Then you all can pull up your responses and then we can talk a little bit about what you all chose and why. Okay, so let's get started again at 4:35. Okay, so since I realized that I might have gone a bit fast, I want to focus a little bit more on the wireframe just to make sure that everyone understands. So first off, I'd like to pose any questions. So does anyone have any questions about what I went through, any areas where it might have been a little bit confusing? Or maybe things that you had some ideas, maybe related to your own idea, and you'd like to know how I would go about creating that on the wireframe.
I had a question on how do you decide, I guess, depending on what your idea is, when to put like a submenu drop down, when to put categories and things like that?
So yeah, it's a really good question. And I think it all comes down to the user story. So you want it to be as simple as possible. With the submenu dropdown, the reason why I decided I wanted that is because with a horizontal navigation bar like this, you can only fit really especially on mobile, you can only fit 4 different categories. But I knew that I wanted to have multiple causes, right, to help with these influencers, right? Because the influencers, I put as part of their story, they wanted campaigns for specific causes. So because I knew I wanted to represent several different causes, I knew that I couldn't fit them here. Therefore, I had to make sort of a larger category of causes that then drop down into these other causes. Does that make sense? So it's sort of, we have a certain amount of content that we need to include in order to fulfill the user stories that we've created. And then sometimes you just can't fit it onto a phone. And that's where the wireframes can actually be really helpful, because you can get a little bit of a dose of reality about what can actually fit on the phone screen and what needs to maybe be filtered or using a search bar or a drop down. There's a lot of different tools that you've seen with the apps that you use that might enable you to do that. Another example might be, for instance, Zaid's VR idea of having different VR solutions for mental health, but maybe there's different categories within that, right? So let's say he's got 100 different videos that he thinks he wants to include, but he doesn't want to fit that all on one phone, because you'd end up scrolling for several minutes just to find the video you want. So he decides he wants filter categories of maybe here his categories might be something along the lines of, socializing, therapy or something. And then another thing might be educational. Another might be, telemedicine, doctor checkups, right? So there's all sorts of different things that he might come up with based on what he feels the needs of his customers are. Does that answer your question, Derek?
Yeah, sort of. It's just when following you, it was a little difficult because we're trying to make it our own idea as well, but then it not necessarily relates to what your setup was. So that's why
So why don't we experiment with a couple ideas? So Derek, what in particularly are you trying to do? What screen might you be working on that you might be stuck on?
For me, I guess it's like a search engine, but then a search engine that pops up multiple suggestions, but then those suggestions are links to another page dedicated to that one item.
Mm-hmm.
So say I searched up a word and then it's possibly 2 different things, one relating to a medication, or say one relating to some sort of lung disease. You would have all those suggestions pop up, and then you'd click one and then that would take you to another page and things like that. So something with, I guess, not really a sub menu drop down, but something of the same thing where you search something and it gives you a bunch of suggestions and you can click on it and stuff like that.
Sure. So why don't we do class ideas? So I'll create a frame called class ideas. And Derek, would yours be mobile or desktop?
Mobile, for sure, mobile.
All right, so let's put an iPhone here. Now you mentioned there'd be a search bar, right?
And that's all I really have for mine right now, is just the search bar.
Okay, so we've got search box. I put that here. And now you're gonna have results. And would those results be more text or images?
That I haven't really.
Or maybe a table.
I'm a proponent of less is more. So maybe just like really aesthetic looking words, as opposed to clearing it with like a picture and like a small description, you know?
Sure, sure. So, you know, I don't know exactly what that would look like, but let's browse a little bit. Okay, so we want would it be containers? Probably not, no, but maybe forms. Oh, how about this checkbox thing? Well, you know, this is a start, right? So this is probably not what you're looking for, but it can at least be a placeholder while you look for something that you like better. And then you mentioned like what some of them might be, right? So what?
Or like I was thinking like a list of suggestions pop up.
Mm-hmm.
Or in this case, I would use that form or that, I'm not sure what it was again that you clicked. Was it checkbox?
Yeah, this is checkbox, which might not be the right one, but.
But that actually looks really good for an option for like a filter, maybe.
Okay, so let's do that then. So this might be a filter.
Okay, so you can.
What would some of the categories be?
It'd be like medication, or maybe medical condition, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Could be like that's all I can think about right now.
Okay, cool. So why don't we just do those two for now? All right, so that way, and then somehow we got to tell the user what it looks like. So I'm going to type filter into the quick add.
Mm-hmm.
So this way the user knows that it's a filter. All right, and then we've got a list of results that you're looking to put in, right?
How it either takes you to, either drops down on the bottom or takes you to another page full of results or suggested results.
So here's one accordion, right? And again, this is the sort of thing where you don't have to know what it is, but just sort of drag it in and see how it looks.
Okay.
Right? So maybe accordion is what you want. And then you get this list, and then when you click on item 1, it shows an image, right? So I'm going to click image in the quick add and then put that here.
Oh, okay.
You see, so this is all thinking out loud. Who knows if this is the right way to do it, but maybe it'd be like this. And then when you click image 1, that image shows up. You click item 2, the other image shows up. And then you mentioned that you also wanted to have this, when you click on one.
Yeah, it takes you to like a dedicated page on
Go
just.
to a dedicated page, right? And then what would that page look like?
I'm thinking the actual term, big bold, maybe a picture too, and then some sort of SparkNotes Wikipedia description on what it is. You know.
Okay, so we'll just leave that as a big title. Then we're going to put an image underneath a big title. And then I'm clicking text. So I'm going to look for that block of text, right? That placeholder of gibberish. So maybe this is it. And then below this, you might want to have them do something, right? So you might want to put buttons. Oops. So maybe this button says no. And then this button says yes. Cool. And then maybe I want to make the yes button green. And then just leave the no button white, right? So that's an example of what it might look like. And as you I would encourage all of you to just create the simplest possible wireframe at first, and then add features on top of it once you've done that, because there's nothing more intimidating than a blank page, right? You want to at least have something there, and then you can start to work with that to figure out ways to make it look better or to fit what you're looking for more. Okay?
Thanks, Will. That helped a lot.
Good, good. Safuni.
I wanted to ask, like, does Balsamiq wireframe works only for the apps that requires internet only, or there's an option for those who doesn't require internet?
You mean for ideas that require internet?
No, like like here we are creating an app like which requires like internet. What about like if I want to create something that can maybe like a messenger or message or text, text oriented app that doesn't require it?
Absolutely. I think it could absolutely be used for a messenger. So why don't we create that? So I'm going to create another frame, and we're going to call this messenger. All right. So I just copied what we have with Derek's, but then I'm going to delete it. All right. What would your messenger look like?
Because I was thinking like something which like a text oriented, like when you like two people conversing with each other. So it's, I hope he
So I think that would absolutely work, right? I typed message, right? And then I got this list of different things. So, here might be someone who's typing, and then let's see if we can find, you might just, in your case, type an example conversation that happens, right? So, how can I help you, right? And then maybe you respond. What kind of messenger might this be used for?
For the connection between the pharmaceutical, maybe with caregivers. So, for example, I can help you. Maybe he wants to know the dosage for a certain kind of medicine.
Okay, so then maybe they say, "Let me check," or something like that. So you might show what that text conversation looks like, but then of course your app should have more than just the messaging capabilities. So what might be some of the inputs that you might have from the patient in order to facilitate that conversation?
I hope maybe for like, maybe the provider will give you like option, choose 1, 2, or 3, and then
okay. And
then the 1, 2, 3 gives you an option of adding maybe patient informations. And
I like
then
that.
and then after giving patient information, then if the patient is maybe at the range of this age to this, you can press 1 and then gives you the details of what you're looking for.
Okay, so I'm going to type radio again. So let's say I want radio buttons here. So this might be what you were talking about, the 1, 2, 3. So here they might say, what medications, are you taking? And then we might just have, some different medications. Something like that. And then that patient would then submit, right? So I'm going to add a button, typing button here. Submit. So that's just an example of what that might look like. And let's say I want to make this one, you know, a red button. Okay. Does that help, Sufuni?
Yes, yes. Thank you.
Okay, great. Anyone else want to run their ideas by the wireframe for some ideas of how to do it? I think the more different types of apps we can go through, I think the more helpful it'll be for everyone as they progress with their wireframes.
I just had a question.
Yes.
So in terms of when we do the wireframe, how much of it like should we do? Because you had like all 4 of the links on top, but you only did like one drop down menu for the quizzes, and you didn't do anything for the about. Like, do we do all of those or just like one?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. And I would say let your patient stories dictate that. So I want you to think about what are the most important patient stories? What are some of the functions that would help solve those patient stories, or, you know, make those stories realities for those users? And then once you've solved them all, then you're good to go. Now, I'm putting as a stipulation for the wireframe that you have like 5 different functional features, right? They're not functional, but just features, whether that's, you know, a button, a tab, an image, or something like that. 5 different things that you can show. But other than that, they don't all have to be functional. If the about us is not satisfying the main user story that I care about, then don't worry about it. Does that answer your question? Okay, great.
Thank you.
All right, any other questions or ideas that you want to run through the wireframe?
I kind of have like something put on my thing, but I don't know what else to do like for like the next steps.
Sure. Would you mind sharing your screen? I can.
Oh yeah, sure.
Okay, let's see if I stop my share.
It says host disabled, attendee screen sharing.
Oh, okay. Are you able to share it with me, the document?
Like, okay, like through email?
Yeah. So if you do the share on the upper right.
Gotcha. It's still loading. I don't know why it's so slow.
That was a problem with me too. Okay, so don't worry about that. But if you all have any questions along the way, specific to your wireframe, just send me an email and then I can help take care of that during office hours. And actually, speaking of office hours, I created a poll. I wanted to make sure that everyone is able to meet during the office hour times. So I've created a few options for office hours. I'm going to launch them. If you all could choose the 2 or 3 times that work best for you, then I will change up the office hours to match those times so that everyone is able to meet with me this week while you work on your wireframes. Okay, so any other questions about wireframes, or anyone have any ideas that they want to run through?
Actually, yeah. So as far as my idea was concerned, and by the way, thanks for elaborating on that, but as far as just the fundamentals are concerned, I don't know about you personally, just thinking about the concept, but I personally can't really see it applying in, just in terms of a mobile application.
Mm-hmm.
So as far as a desktop is concerned, would you mind just running through an example of that just really quickly, just so we can kind of get an idea of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we have the desktop, right, with your idea, you know, I think the easiest way to kind of, I guess, illustrate what it might look like would be kind of like a YouTube, or at least that's the way I can think of, right? I'm sure there's plenty of other ways as well. But let's say that we've got this for, you know, mental health VR videos, something like that. And then we might have an array of different videos that they can then choose from. And I might add a subtitle under each one. All right, so this might be video 1. Actually, let's add some of that text, block of text. So we've got some info here. All right, maybe there's a like and dislike button. There we go. Something like that, and then you just repeat that across the 3. You know, maybe you want to put like a filter in, and then you just specify, you know, what kind of filters might that look like. So is that helpful about what it might look like on desktop?
Absolutely.
Cool. Yeah, and you know, there's not too much, I think, at the wireframing. I think the biggest danger is that you try to do too much. So please don't do that. Just try to make it, think about what is the simplest possible way that you can solve that user story. Don't put the fancy stuff in until later, once you get really into the concept and you start to maybe do some user testing and getting feedback from those users about features that they might want to see implemented. So at the beginning, before you've even talked to any users, just do the simplest possible implementation that addresses the user story that you've come up with. Any questions about that? Is that helpful for everyone? Yes.
Okay, so it's more just like in this in general. From last week, I thought I understood that we were going to be like put into groups today and then making one wireframe based on like which project we were doing. So are we each individually doing a wireframe for like all of the projects we've come up with? Or
yes, yeah.
Okay.
Apologies for the confusion there. So the wireframe would just be individual homework. And then we'll present those wireframes to the class. And then among those, we'll choose which ones we will then turn into prototypes as part of the group projects. And the main reason for that, I think, is as a group, especially working long distance from each other, working remotely, it's really hard to collaborate on design, or at least on that level. I think it'll make much more sense to just settle on a concept and then start to work in your different functional teams of, you know, someone focusing on the design part, someone focusing on the content part, someone doing the project management for the teamwork. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, any other questions that I can highlight in front of you? This is a good opportunity, and I'm happy to do this with you all, either individually or within groups during office hours for people who would like further explanation. But right now you've got a captive professor. I can, you know, go over any questions that you all have. All right, so we'll move forward. So back to user testing. If we go back to that question that we had in the assignment, does anyone want to talk about the answer that they put for the type of user testing that they would like to use?
Go ahead and speak mine.
Yes.
I actually picked 2. I know you said to pick 1, but I thought that it was important to have 2. So I picked the retrospective probing as well as concurrent think out aloud. I thought that they kind of both tied in well with each other because retrospective, you're looking at, you're kind of like able to analyze like, okay, this is how I felt during it. Let me like gather my thoughts and then like give my ideas then about what was happening. Whereas like concurrent, throughout it, you're able to like give your thoughts and opinions and just kind of be able to like give a more like accurate response, whereas like the retrospective part was like you're relying heavily more on like how you thought after the experience. So that's kind of why I kind of chose both, but no, you said one, but
No, that's good. That's good. And does anyone else want to expand upon that, about maybe why you chose one or the other, or what context do you think that one might be better for?
I kind of did the same thing in that, so I picked concurrent for like the first part, just because I know personally when it comes to me, like I forget really easily about things. So I would kind of want that test if it was me. So I can get the people's reactions right away. And then after those adjustments are made, then I would do the retrospective just to kind of make things like move along a little faster.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, I think. Would anyone like to maybe talk about what they plan on doing with their specific idea when they user test? And if there's any reason why they might choose one over the other.
So I don't know if this makes any sense or whether it's done in the real world, but personally, I'm thinking of doing the concurrent, but with video monitoring, so you're not necessarily interrupting their workflow, because kind of like what's been hinted at, personally, I really don't trust myself, let alone someone else to really keep their thoughts fresh or remember what exactly they were thinking in the moment, let alone something that occurred a few minutes or heck, even an hour ago. So just to kind of avoid that, to avoid any kind of memory decay or confabulation or anything like that, I'm definitely just sticking with concurrent, but again, in a way that doesn't really allow for any kind of interruption.
Yeah. Yeah, that's some, I think, good thinking around that. And I think on video, recording can be very beneficial as well. Of course, anytime you record, you have to let the participant know that you'll be recording it. But for the most part, if they're willing to be a test subject on your user testing, they won't mind if it's recorded. Okay, anyone else want to share their thoughts? All right, so we'll go back one slide. So user testing, one of the key questions that you have to ask with user testing is how many participants do you want to use? There's actually a study, it was 20 years ago, but they analyzed basically how many problems were found based on how many participants they had go through the user testing. And they found this curve right here, which is actually very reminiscent of a lot of management observations. There's the idea of the Pareto Rule, where the top 80% of the top 80% of lost productivity is from the 20% of problems. So it's the 80-20 rule. And you actually see this right here, where here you actually get to 80% of all your problems after having only really talked to a small amount of users. So here, based on this test, they recommend that after about 5 users, you've pretty much uncovered all of the problems. Now that doesn't mean that you only want to test five users and then be done with it, but it just goes to show that at some point it's diminishing returns. So you really only need to have probably anywhere from maybe 4 to 8 participants in your user testing before you're ready to probably roll out that iteration, and then move on to the next iteration where you can test again. So it's better to kind of going along the same lines of let's break this into small chunks and keep giving the customer new things to assess for us, as opposed to doing this one huge chunk that you're then going to test in like 100 users. Here it's keep it small, keep it short, keep rolling out new features. So that's, again, part of the Agile methodology of break it down as much as possible so that you can be in close contact with the user and you don't end up making a huge investment for something that they might not even want. So for your cohort on user testing, and this will be a little bit down the road, a few weeks down the road as you all are working in teams on your prototype, I'd like you to think about maybe 3 to 4 fellow students, and then 1 to 2, if possible, even more, of your target demographic. So I realize that finding that demographic might be difficult, but if you can at least find 1 or 2 members, they can sometimes be the most helpful with uncovering some of the issues with your product, as well as some of the things that they like. So almost anyone can help with finding user experience issues, but there are some issues that can only be observed by watching your target audience perform tasks. So if you're doing something, for instance, that's designed for a provider, there's some issues that just only they are going to know about because they know what their day-to-day looks like. They know when they have time to maybe go onto your app or onto the computer to use your tool. So most of these issues, yes, you can find by testing with your peers, but you're going to want to have at least 1 or 2 tests with your target demographic. So start thinking about who those people might be that you might be connected to. Okay, so user testing methods. I'll go through this relatively quickly because it was part of the assignment. So there's concurrent versus retrospective. So on the concurrent, the whole idea is that they share their thoughts oftentimes out loud. And the whole idea is that they might not be able to remember after they do the testing where they had issues. So best to get all that out as they go. The problem is that talking it's not natural, right? When they're actually using your app or your software, they're not going to be talking out loud. So you're kind of taking them out of their moment a little bit. So you just have to be aware of any issues that those interruptions might cause. Retrospective is where you actually let them naturally interact with the software or app as they normally would, and then you follow up afterwards. So of course the downside to that is that they might forget certain things that that gave them issue, or they might forget certain things that they really liked. So there's obviously a trade-off, and I think you all did a good job of explaining where some of those trade-offs lie. Recording can also be very helpful to the point where you might be able to do less interruption and then just review the tape afterwards to figure out where some issues that you might want to work on might exist. So a little bit on moderating technique. It's always good to use a test script. So I gave a link that you can use for these test scripts. But if you don't use that link, at least have something that you can follow. Don't just try to wing the whole thing because that might be disruptive to the user if you're struggling with, the order that you want to go in. In addition to being disruptive, it also can be inconsistent. So consistency is very important from user to user, right? One user might love the product, but only because you gave them a fantastic introduction, right? When you were starting the testing. You don't want those variables to come into play when you get the user feedback. So for that reason, it's important to follow a script. Second, you don't really want opinions. You just want areas for improvement. So you're looking for them to identify confusing areas, identify areas that seem to work really well. It's nice to hear their opinions of, oh, you should do this feature or that feature, but don't take them too seriously because everyone's got a ton of opinions, and unless it's really that target audience member that really can offer a lot of insight into what their day-to-day looks like, I would say weight those features relatively low, because otherwise you'll just get carried away with trying to implement way too many features to please everyone. Next, set the stage for the user, but don't guide them. So don't tell them what to do. Never tell them what to do, because they'll never have you to tell them what to do when they're using the app in real life. So the best questions or the best responses when they ask you what to do is, what do you think? So answer their questions with a question. Try to get inside of their head as much as possible rather than putting things inside of their head. And then lastly, compare their subjective rating against their performance metrics. So there's how they tell you they experience the platform in the retrospective. And then there's also the results, right? So they might hesitate left and right. They might not know which button to push. They might click the button you don't want them to push and then say that they had an excellent experience. Their qualitative feedback is important, but it also has to be looked at in the context of what you've observed while they were going through the process. So any questions about those different techniques to use? Okay, so I'll run through an example test session. So first, you're going to want to welcome the user. As part of that, you want to explain what usability testing is. A lot of the times, these users have no idea what usability testing is. So explain them a little bit about the fact that you want them to think out loud, but you can't really give them too much guidance because they wouldn't get it in real life. Just some of the basics that actually show up in the script that I linked here. Then get some demographic questions. So you want to note, is this a provider? Is this a specific patient? Is it just a friend that you have? You want to give context to the people who are going to be looking at those notes. Second, you want to introduce the scenario. So especially if they're not part of the target demographic, you want to get them into the mindset of have them pretend to be a doctor if they're not a doctor, or pretend to be maybe a clinical trial sponsor if they're not. That way they can get in the right mindset and not come at it as they would be, say, just a normal user. If they happen to be that target audience, try to put them in a certain setting, right? Maybe they're in the OR and they need information about the vitals of a patient. Just put them into that specific scenario, help them imagine where they are before they start the user testing. After that, the user starts the task. So make sure that they think aloud. Really emphasize that because it's not a natural behavior. If you're doing concurrent testing, make sure that they're really telling you all of the thoughts that are going through their head. Good question. If you find that they seem to be struggling with something, maybe you can read in their eyes that something's going on, but they're not saying anything. It's just ask them, what are you thinking right now? It's very simple, open-ended. Also note their behavior. Note any comments they make, any errors that they make, as well as task completions that they succeed in. You want to note all that. That's sort of your quantitative data. How long it takes to complete something is another example. And then finally, debrief. So this is especially important for retrospective because this is where you get all of your information, but it also is important if they're talking throughout. You want to let them look back and think, what was their overall experience? You, at this point, can share your notes with them, right? So say, hey, I noticed that you're kind of fumbling around at the About Us section. Could you tell me a little bit about that? What was going through your mind? So this is a good opportunity to capture some of maybe what you didn't capture during the observation period. Okay, any questions on that? Okay, I want to dive a little bit in the 15 minutes that we have left into the FDA usability guidance. So the FDA has traditionally regulated software interfaces on devices, and they've actually gotten more and more into this as digital health has become more and more of a reality. So the importance of this has grown significantly. You can see it in this red, right? So you have the user that is operating a given medical device, you have the device that is actually doing something, and then you have this interface, which back in the day was just the screen on the device. But now this red part, the interface, could actually be the whole thing. You know, we're getting to the point where it's not just digital interfaces on top of an existing device, sometimes the digital part is the whole thing, right? Here we talk about some of these apps, or probably a lot of what you all are going to come up with have nothing to do with a medical device, but instead of just a pure software play. So the FDA, because of this, is expanding their role and their guidance as well as regulations around user device interface. So they draw out what are some possible errors that can happen. And these, again, are some of the errors that you're looking for during your user testing. So there's unintended versus intended, right? You can go from the intended to correct use as well as abnormal use. And then on the unintended, there's the concept of slip, lapse, and mistake. And I'll go through some of those. So slip, and by the way, the unintended are sort of what is considered a user error. So a slip means that they're not paying attention and maybe they click the wrong button, right? So I'm trying to navigate the slides. I accidentally go backwards when I didn't mean to. Instead, I meant to go forwards. So that's an example of a slip. A lapse is a memory failure, right? So with a lot of these tools, you can run them perfectly if you remember everything. Sometimes you don't remember. In fact, oftentimes users will forget. So there might be holes in your initial product design that require the user to remember too much about maybe what they've inputted in the past or about instructions on how to use the software. And so that can result in a lapse. Maybe they forget to input something, right? Maybe it's an EHR type of thing, right? Mohammed was talking about as AI for EHRs. Maybe they sometimes forget to input patient vitals, right? His AI could potentially prevent that failure by putting an alert. Hey, we noticed that you didn't enter the cholesterol reading. Maybe you should do that. And then there's mistake. So software is complicated, right? I mean, we saw this with Balsamiq, right? It's when something's new, especially, there's a lot of ignorance. You don't know how to use all the features. And so you might make a mistake because of that. So some common UI errors. One is complexity leads to confusion. So this is an example of an overly complex software system. Nobody would know how to use this. You know, this is the type of thing where if it's in a company, you've got like the one person who knows how to use this software, and this is their job security. So don't create anything like this. You want something that someone can easily learn how to use within, you know, say, ideally less than a day, ideally maybe less than 5 minutes, but some that are maybe more complicated, at least that they can learn in less than like a week. Another common error is error correction is too difficult. So maybe they make an error and it says something like, hey, you have to contact an administrator to repair the entry before proceeding. That's the type of thing where if it's contact an administrator, a lot of people aren't going to want to do it. Now, nowadays, there's a lot of new features like chatbots that can be helpful. So maybe you pair them with an administrator automatically, or first you pair them with the bot, then they talk to the bot a little bit, you figure out who the right person within your company is behind the curtain to talk to them, and then it works that way. So there's a lot of ways to make error correction a lot easier than just picking up the phone and calling someone like it used to be. But that can be a common error where you require them to do something that's just a little bit too much work, they don't feel like doing it, and then they end up making an error down the road. FDA cares about this, of course, because when people make errors due to software difficulties in the medical field, that can lead to worse outcomes for patients. Another common error is that obvious errors are not corrected. So going back to the example about the AI with EHRs, you know, some errors the machine should just pick up on, or the software should pick up on immediately, right? If you mark that a male patient is pregnant, that should be caught, right? Because that's impossible, at least as far as I know. So here's an example where someone entered their name on the email and it just says, come on, you know, that's not a valid email. So that's a way where software can catch some common errors that are just obvious. Okay, another common error that the FDA really emphasizes is where the user interface fails to draw attention to dangerous conditions. So here it says your order is potentially redundant. Last serological test for Hep B virus was here. Close this window to cancel, proceed with your order. So here it's just drawing attention to the fact that, hey, you already ordered this test, and to do so again, something's going on. So did you mean to do something else? So it's kind of another thing where it's trying to catch errors before they happen. And the FDA has really come down on some companies where they made it too easy to make a mistake. A physician might order the wrong test. They didn't send an alert like this, and then that led to problems down the road. Another potential error is where non-critical situations are identified as critical, right? So here's sort of the pregnant guy example. Your order is potentially dangerous if given to pregnant women. This is for a patient named John Doe, not a woman. So here it's giving alerts too often. And this is actually a problem right now with a lot of EHRs that are built by billion-dollar companies. And there's an article actually in Fortune a few months back called Death by 1,000 Clicks. And it talked about how frustrated physicians are by some of these ridiculous alerts that come up on the EHRs that say they prescribe something like thalidomide. Is anyone familiar with thalidomide? So it's I see a couple nods. Who wants to talk about that? Okay, well, anyway, thalidomide was basically a drug that was prescribed to a lot of people. I think, I actually don't remember what it was used for, but it was prescribed to many people, including pregnant women, and their children ended up being born with a lot of health problems. And so because of that, a lot of even modern day health records, whenever someone orders thalidomide, will pop up an alert that says, caution, do not prescribe to pregnant women. That's great, but it turns out that with some of these softwares, it's even popping up for men. So that's something where you give a physician too many alerts, they get into a habit of just clicking the X button. So you don't want to over alert for problems that aren't really problems.
I believe the thalidomide pill was prescribed for pregnant women to help them sleep and with nausea and things like that. So it was like a pregnancy medication.
Gotcha.
And later on, that's when they started figuring out that everyone was being born with defects because of it.
Yeah, and it's still being used. Obviously not for pregnant women, but so that's become a bit of a problem. Where again they try to prescribe it for someone who's not pregnant, and then they get these messages. So that's also a problem. They call it alert fatigue, and you want to make sure that whatever your solution is does not run into danger of doing that. But at the same time, if we go back, is also drawing attention where it should be brought up to whoever the user is. All right, finally, I want to introduce the concept of device hazard analysis. So this is basically, it's a 2 criteria analysis of what your different risks are. So the FDA finds this sort of analysis very important, and particularly with user interfaces. So, and this can be used with your user testing as well. So I mentioned that a lot of things will come up with your user testing. Some features might be very important. Some issues might not be important at all. It helps to have a framework to analyze the severity or the importance of a particular risk or particular issue. One way to do this is called device hazard analysis. And what you do is you measure that particular risk along 2 different continuums. So the first is severity. So if this risk ends up occurring, what is the severity of it? Is it catastrophic, right? Is this something that might cause permanent injury or death? Or is it just a nuisance? Is it just gonna be like an alert that someone has to click out of? And then there's probability. So how often does this occur? It's going to happen literally all the time with like every time they use the app? Or is it something that is not even likely to occur during the entire time that the user is using this particular device or software? So the FDA has released guidance around how you should think about certain risks. So as an example, if it occurs a lot, if it's definitely likely to happen, and it's catastrophic, this is a big issue. It's an unacceptable risk. If it's not likely to occur, but it's a huge issue, then they say, well, do some research. There's no clear right or wrong, but they delegate that to the manufacturer to basically assess. I know that it would be horrible if this went wrong, but it's unlikely to happen. Should I still figure out a way to address it? So basically your goal is usually to do one of two things. With these unacceptable risks, either figure out a way to make them less likely to occur or figure out a way to mitigate the danger if they end up occurring. So this is very commonly used. I use it at my old job at Baxter Healthcare. It's used all the time as a way to analyze things that could go wrong with your product. So I would encourage you to use this as you identify risks, if you identify risks with your product. And the one unique thing about being in the healthcare industry is that pretty much any product that you make can cause potential risk or harm to the patient. So you really do need to take this sort of hazard analysis seriously. So that's it from the lectures. I have one more slide on the assignment for this week, but before I move on, any questions on the lecture itself? Okay, so the assignments. Code Academy, so please do CSS lessons 1 through 3. This is a link to there. There's also a link to there on the assignments. One thing that I want to bring up, because some people had a little bit of trouble with the HTML, is the assignment on Sakai. It actually draws out the different lessons that need to be completed. So it's modules, lessons 1 through 3. But if you're confused about which badges you should end up with, it's spelled out in the assignments. And then next, this is kind of the big one. So I want you to have your wireframe mockup ready to present in the class. It's a mockup, it's a wireframe. It doesn't have to be this perfect, aesthetically pleasing thing. It just needs to get across the function that your product is supposed to achieve insofar as it addresses the user story, okay? So you drew up the user story during this class session. If you want to change that around, you're free to do that. But I just want to make sure that you've thought through the user story and you've developed a wireframe mockup that addresses the user story. I also want there to be a minimum of 5 wireframe functions. Could be anything from a button to a link, a data input, doesn't really matter. Just put 5 of those little, stickies in so that I can see that you're working through the Balsamiq features to see how it can be used to build features into an app. Because those are going to be things when you build the prototype that we're going to learn how to code. I want you to annotate function by using arrows. So I want you to have at least one of those arrows that shows the relationship between a previous state, then when you click a button, it leads to a next state. So I want you to do that at least once to show function. And then describe the use case from start to end. So that storyboard that you made, I want you to be able to illustrate that through your mockup, right? So it's essentially a more visual way of showing what you did with your storyboard. And I think the storyboards that you shared with me were all fantastic. I think they all would work. None of them were too ambitious. I think there's always a way to simplify it to something that can be accomplished during this class. If you need help from me to do that, just let me know. Any questions about the assignments? Okay, great. I'll send an email out with office hour details because I want to make sure that everyone's got an opportunity to do office hours this week for questions that they might have about their mockup. And even if I don't set official office hours on a time that works for you, just put a time that you want on the office hour sign up, and then I will work to accommodate with you. So maybe put a couple times that work for you, and then I'll figure out which time works best with my schedule. All right. Thanks, class. That's it.